What if the man America adored the most, the youngest, most charismatic president in its history, was living a secret life darker than anyone could imagine? John F. Kennedy wasn't just a politician. He was a man driven by desire, power, and recklessness. Behind the charm that captivated the world was a web of hidden affairs that reached deep into Hollywood, the White House, and even the criminal underworld. His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, knew everything and chose silence. But some of the women he touched would pay the ultimate price for their connection to him. Ellen Romech, the woman too dangerous to keep. The first crack in John F. Kennedy's carefully constructed image of perfection appeared not in Hollywood gossip columns or campaign exposés, but inside the marble halls of Washington itself. Her name was Ellen Romech, and for a brief moment in 1963, this German-born woman was the most feared name in the Capitol. She was young, breathtakingly beautiful, and unlike most of Kennedy's other women, she wasn't part of high society. She came from the shadows. Ellen had arrived in the United States as the wife of a German sergeant. She found work as a hostess at the Quorum Club, a private lounge where politicians, lobbyists, and journalists gathered away from prying eyes. The club's owner, Bobby Baker, a close aide to Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson, was known for introducing powerful men to women who could keep secrets. That was where she met the president. At first it seemed harmless, a few meetings, some laughter, maybe a dinner. But this was the early 1960s, the height of the Cold War, when every relationship carried a potential risk. Ellen's accent, her background, and her mysterious social climb quickly caught the attention of the FBI. When Director J. Edgar Hoover learned that the President of the United States might be seeing a woman suspected of having foreign intelligence ties, alarm bells rang. Reports later revealed that Ellen attended multiple late-night pool parties at the White House, events described by witnesses as informal, but known within inner circles to be sexual in nature. Some guests were congressmen, others celebrities, and all were sworn to silence. It wasn't just about moral scandal anymore. If even one photo, one document, or one whispered conversation reached Moscow, the consequences could be catastrophic. Behind the scenes, panic erupted. Robert Kennedy, serving as Attorney General, realized the risk immediately. If word got out that his brother, the leader of the free world, was sleeping with a woman potentially linked to Eastern Bloc intelligence, it could destroy the administration overnight. Acting quietly, he ordered Ellen's immediate deportation under the pretext of immigration violations. Within days, she was gone. But Ellen didn't vanish without leaving a trace. She had stories, dangerous ones, about powerful men who had confided in her, trusted her, and in some cases, paid her. When journalists began to ask questions, they were silenced. The press at the time protected the presidency, believing that national stability mattered more than personal truth. A few reporters, including those from the Saturday Evening Post, tried to follow the trail, but the full story was buried for decades. Years later, FBI files confirmed what had been suspected all along. The government had intervened directly to save Kennedy from exposure. Ellen Romech became a ghost, living quietly in Germany, refusing to discuss the affair until her death. She never wrote a book, never gave an interview, never sought revenge. But for Washington insiders, the lesson was unforgettable. Kennedy's charm wasn't just irresistible, it was dangerous. The Ellen Romech case proved that the president's private indulgences could threaten public safety, and it was the first clear sign that his double life wasn't just immoral, it was unsustainable. Gunilla von Post, the love that almost changed history. Before the White House, before the scandals and Secret Service cover-ups, there was a story of genuine love, the kind that could have rewritten American history if it hadn't been buried by ambition. Her name was Gunilla von Post, a young Swedish aristocrat who met John F. Kennedy long before he became a president or a symbol. She was 24, he was 36, a U.S. senator already engaged to Jacqueline Bouvier. They met in the summer of 1953 at a dinner party on the French Riviera, surrounded by laughter, champagne, and the golden haze of Mediterranean light. Gunilla later wrote that she hadn't known who he was, only that he had the saddest blue eyes she'd ever seen. Kennedy, she said, seemed different from the polished politicians she'd met before. Vulnerable, curious, almost lonely. They danced, they walked along the beach, and before the night was over, something unspoken connected them. Just weeks later, Kennedy returned to the U.S. and married Jackie. The marriage, arranged as much for political advantage as affection, was a turning point in his career, but it didn't end his feelings for Gunilla. Over the next few years, they exchanged letters, tender and conflicted, filled with longing and regret. In one of the most revealing, Kennedy wrote, "I am lonely and would do anything to be with you again." Those words, written by a man destined for the presidency, were the confessions of someone torn between love and destiny. In 1955, they reunited secretly in Sweden. Gunilla recalled meeting him at the pier where he arrived smiling, holding a single rose. They spent several days together at her family's estate in Tosterup, walking by the water and speaking of what might have been. Kennedy told her he had even discussed leaving Jackie with his father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., but Joseph refused. A divorce, he warned, would destroy his son's political future before it began. That moment ended the possibility of their life together. Kennedy returned to the United States and buried himself in politics, while Gunilla married a Swedish nobleman years later. Yet she kept every letter, every memory. Decades after his assassination, she finally published her memoir, Love, Jack, revealing details of a man who, in private, was tender and self-doubting, the complete opposite of the confident leader history remembers. In 2021, some of their letters resurfaced at a Boston auction, selling for over $15,000. The words, written in Kennedy's familiar handwriting, still carried the ache of impossible love. If only things were different. They weren't political statements. They were heartbreak in ink. Gunilla lived until 2011, long after the myth of Camelot had faded. She never sought fame, never exploited her connection to him. For her, he wasn't a president or an icon. He was the man who once held her hand under the Riviera moon and promised to find a way back. He never did. In a life built on ambition, Kennedy's story with Gunilla von Post was the one time love came before power, and he let it slip away. Years later, as historians pieced together his many affairs, this one stood apart. It wasn't reckless or scandalous. It was sincere. But it was also the first sign of a pattern, that Kennedy could love deeply and still choose politics over people. And from that moment on, his heart belonged not to a woman, but to history itself. Fiddle and Faddle, the White House secretaries. By the early 1960s, John F. Kennedy's private life had become a dangerous open secret. His charm, the same magnetic quality that captivated voters, had also become his greatest weakness. Inside the walls of the White House, boundaries blurred between duty and desire, and nowhere was this more evident than in his relationship with two young secretaries known only by their teasing nicknames, Fiddle and Faddle. Their real names were Priscilla Ware and Jill Cowan, both barely in their 20s when they were hired as part of Kennedy's personal staff. On paper, they were White House secretaries. In reality, their presence served a very different purpose. The nicknames, reportedly given by cynical insiders in the Secret Service, were cruel jokes reflecting how openly these women were known to be part of Kennedy's private indulgences. Accounts from staffers and journalists who later broke their silence describe an atmosphere that felt more like a private club than the office of the U.S. president. The pool in the White House basement became infamous among insiders, a secluded place where the president and his chosen companions could swim and relax away from the press. Several witnesses later confirmed seeing Fiddle and Faddle at their desks with wet hair, returning from swims that were clearly more personal than professional. The brazenness was astonishing. Kennedy wasn't sneaking through secret tunnels or hiding in hotel rooms anymore. He was conducting affairs inside the White House itself, sometimes in the middle of the workday, while Jackie and the children were elsewhere. He took Fiddle and Faddle on official trips to Europe and Latin America, where their names appeared on flight manifests as personal aides. The irony was striking. Taxpayers were footing the bill for the president's private escapades. Jackie Kennedy knew. By 1962, she had grown accustomed to humiliation cloaked in polite silence. During a tour of the White House with a reporter from Paris Match, she pointed to Priscilla Ware's desk and said, half in jest but fully aware of the truth, "That's the girl who's sleeping with my husband." Her tone was calm, her smile perfect, but behind it was quiet exhaustion. She had learned that confrontation would only lead to scandal, and scandal could destroy everything. For Kennedy, these encounters weren't about passion or companionship anymore. They were about control, a sense of invincibility that came from knowing no one dared to stop him. Even the Secret Service, sworn to protect him, protected his secrets instead. Agents arranged transportation, shielded entrances, and turned away reporters who got too close. Historians would later call this period the Camelot illusion, the public dream of a perfect American dynasty masking a private moral collapse. In those years, Kennedy's recklessness reached its peak. The man who inspired a generation to believe in service and sacrifice was, behind closed doors, indulging in selfish impulses that mocked the very ideals he preached. For the two young women, the price of proximity to power was steep. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, both Fiddle and Faddle disappeared from public view almost instantly. They were quietly dismissed, their careers in ruins, their reputations whispered about but never officially acknowledged. Neither wrote a book nor sought fame, perhaps out of fear or perhaps out of shame. The story of Fiddle and Faddle endures not because it was the most scandalous, but because it symbolized Kennedy's dangerous belief that he was untouchable. The White House, a symbol of democracy and moral leadership, had become the setting of indulgence and secrecy, and it showed how far Kennedy had fallen from the man America thought he was. Marilyn Monroe, the affair that haunts history. No name is more entwined with Kennedy's legend than Marilyn Monroe. The world remembers her voice, breathy and teasing, singing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" at Madison Square Garden on May 19, 1962. It was the moment their rumored relationship became immortalized in American mythology. But behind that glittering performance lay something darker. Monroe had been seen with both John and Robert Kennedy on several occasions. Friends claimed she believed she was in love with the president, while others said she was simply another in a long line of fleeting passions. Historians now agree that if there was an affair, it was brief. Possibly a single night at Bing Crosby's Palm Springs home in March 1962. Yet the consequences were enormous. Monroe began calling the White House, leaving messages that worried Kennedy's aides. One of her friends later said she kept a journal of her encounters, a diary that mysteriously disappeared after her death. On August 5, 1962, just 3 months after her iconic birthday song, Marilyn Monroe was found dead from a barbiturate overdose. She was 36 years old. The official verdict was suicide, but conspiracy theories exploded. Some believed she had been silenced to protect the presidency, others that she knew too much about the brothers' private dealings. Judith Campbell, Exner, the mob connection. If Marilyn Monroe's affair was a public spectacle, Judith Campbell Exner's was a ticking time bomb. She met Kennedy through Frank Sinatra in 1960, a connection that should have raised alarms from the start. Sinatra was already linked to organized crime figures, and Exner herself had ties to Sam Giancana, a notorious Chicago mob boss. For nearly 2 years, Judith was Kennedy's mistress. She later claimed that she wasn't just sharing his bed. She was carrying messages between the president and Giancana, serving as a go-between for political favors and covert dealings. If true, this wasn't merely infidelity. It was a national security breach. The relationship became so concerning that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover ordered surveillance on her. When Kennedy learned of it, he abruptly ended the affair. But by then, it was too late. Judith claimed she became pregnant with his child and underwent an abortion to protect his reputation. In later interviews, she described Kennedy as charming yet cold, a man who could make her feel like the only woman in the world one moment and completely invisible the next. Her life unraveled after their breakup. Alcoholism, failed marriages, and isolation followed. She died in 1999, still insisting that her story was true. Mary Pinchot Meyer and Mimi Alford, Secrets and Innocence Lost. Among all the women linked to John F. Kennedy, Mary Pinchot Meyer and Mimi Alford represent the two extremes of his private life: intellect and innocence. Mary was an artist, a socialite, and the ex-wife of CIA official Cord Meyer. Between 1961 and 1963, she and Kennedy were said to share not just intimacy, but deep conversations about politics, spirituality, and the direction of the nation. She challenged him intellectually in ways few others could. But after Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, Mary began expressing doubts about the official story. She told friends she didn't believe Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and began keeping a diary. On October 12, 1964, she was murdered execution-style while walking along the Georgetown towpath. The killer was never found. When her friends went to retrieve her diary, they discovered CIA agent James Jesus Angleton already inside her home, collecting it. The notebook was burned soon after. The implication was chilling. Mary had known too much. Then there was Mimi Alford, the 19-year-old White House intern who began an affair with Kennedy just days after starting her job in 1962. In her 2012 memoir, Once Upon a Secret, she revealed that Kennedy seduced her in Jackie Kennedy's own bedroom, taking her virginity and beginning an 18-month relationship. She later admitted that she never felt she could refuse him, that the power dynamic made real consent impossible. Behind the speeches, the smiles, and the legend of Camelot, John F. Kennedy lived a life built on secrets. For every woman who entered his world, there was a cost. Some lost their innocence, others their peace, and one even her life. The question remains, was Kennedy's charm a gift or a weapon? Do you think his personal life should change how we remember him today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more untold stories from the shadows of history.